Hello, I'm Mr. Rogers,
And I'm Mrs. Froman.
and you are watching the video notes for a new chapter, Chapter 3 on Heredity and Genetics. In this first section, I want you to write down at the top of your notes 3-1. So it's kind of the work of Gregor Mendel, one scientist in particular that we're going to talk about first. And Gregor Mendel, he had some ideas about how genetics worked, and really was called the father of modern genetics. He kind of was a guy who put down those basic rules that are still used today in terms of understanding how traits are passed on from person to person. So I'll let Mrs. Froman kind of jump in there with some of the definitions of what we're talking about.
So what a trait is a physical characteristic that can be passed along by the genes.
So look at like these guys over here. So if you have the unattached earlobe,
yes, or the
attached, the widow's peak, the tongue flipper.
Yeah, I can't do that.
I'm not. No,
I can do the roll.
I can do the roller, not a flipper. There. Yep,
yeah,
me
I can't
too.
Do the flip. So then heredity is the passing those traits from the parent to the offspring. So not being able to flip your tongue because your parents probably didn't carry that and give it to you. So, and a purebred is considered something that produces offspring with the same traits as the parents. I usually, of course, think of purebred dogs. You know, so when you breed golden retrievers, the puppies all look like golden retrievers if both parents are purebred golden retrievers. So but if you have a golden retriever and a husky, that's two different types of genes, so it's not a purebred.
I think of my black lab. If I throw anything, it's a retriever. It's going to bring it back to me. Yep, that's
and that's something all retrievers. It's bred into them. It's in their genes to go get something and bring it back.
Their parents are they're gonna have it. Their offspring's gonna have it. It's gonna keep getting passed on.
Exactly.
All right, so we have the idea of a purebred. So those traits are always passed on. The same traits are being passed on, and the other idea is a hybrid. And I think of like, nowadays we have the hybrid cars or a combination of gas and electric cars. And so in that same breath, they have two different alleles for one trait. So they have kind of a combination of traits that we would say from each parent. I think you mentioned the husky and the lab would have a combination of traits.
Yeah, so it might have like one brown eye and one blue eye. Those huskies tend to have blue eyes.
I've seen that before, yeah. Okay. So we're talking about genetics, and Gregor Mendel was our guy here. And Gregor Mendel was a monk, and he was in charge of the monastery garden. And so he noticed when he was growing a lot of peas in the garden that there's a lot of different physical characteristics he could see. You could see if they were tall, if they were short. You could see if it had the pea had a wrinkled coat or a smooth coat. Some were green, some were yellow. There's all these different traits that you could really see really easily.
Yep.
And he noticed that when we crossed, the idea of purebred and hybrid really comes from Mendel. And so he tried some experiments out. He did a little bit of experimenting, some guesswork. And so he crossed a purebred tall and a purebred short pea plant. And he noticed that the next generation of pea plants that we call the F1 generation, they were all tall. So even though the parents were short and tall, all of the offspring were tall. Well, then he took that generation, that F1 generation, and he crossed them with each other, a little cross-pollination. And so in that next generation, I guess this would be considered the grandkids of that first generation. Then something different happened. Then we had 3/4 of them were tall, and about 1/4 or a quarter of them were short. So now we got still mostly tall, but a few short ones are kind of popping in there. And that's one of the big things he started to notice, that he started seeing patterns appear that kind of put down these rules. I'll let you talk about genes.
All right. So after Mendel discovered all that stuff, then as our technology got better, we realized that all this was on the DNA. And on the DNA are genes. And a gene is, remember all that stuff with the A to T and C to G? A group of those can be a gene that specifies for a certain trait.
There you go. So you got a picture right here. There's a chunk of DNA, this strand right here.
So that strand right there could be blue eyes or brown eyes. And then an allele is the different form of a gene. So we've got our little chromatid there. Yeah, right there. And it's got an allele for purple flowers, but there's another chromatid that has an allele for white flowers. It's at the same spot on the DNA, but it just codes differently. So that means those A's and T's and C's and G's are just in a little different order.
Yep.
And so it's going to cause white flowers instead of the purple flowers.
So we say this allele is on the chromatid. So if I was to focus in right there on that chromatid, it might look something like this, right? Okay.
Exactly.
So we have genes, we have alleles, different forms of a gene. All right, so now when we talk about alleles, again, you get alleles from, like, talking about you, from your parents. And you get one allele for every trait from each parent. So kind of half of that DNA comes from each parent. And so that's why you write it. When we write down alleles, they're usually represented by different letters. So if they're dominant, we always write down the capital letter means that it's a dominant allele. And what a dominant allele means, it's a trait that always shows up when it is present in the DNA. So if you have at least one, in this case we have two, but if there's at least one capital T, that trait's going to appear. And we go back to that tall pea plants. The dominant alleles again have the capital letters. So you always have these two T's. Or two, not necessarily T's, but you have two different letters for every allele, one from each parent, and it can be capital. And so we showed the brown eyes, which is dominant. Brown eyes is a dominant trait. So if your parents have if you get at least one T for the dominant trait from a parent, you're going to have brown eyes.
Then a recessive allele is a trait that only shows up if you have to have both of them. Now with the dominant, you only had to have one. Recessive, you have to have both of them for that trait to show up. So if there's a dominant allele present and you have a recessive, you're not going to see the recessive at all.
So if that one capital, one lowercase.
Right, you're just going to see the dominant trait. So the lowercase is what represents that recessive trait, and blue eyes are recessive. So if you have blue eyes,
which I do, yeah,
and so do I, that means we both have two recessive alleles for blue eyes.
So you got two lowercase letters we represent them with. So that means each parent had to give us one recessive. Yeah. All right, so that goes back to the idea of a hybrid and how we represent it. So we talked about what a hybrid is, the combination of the alleles. They're not the same, I guess, is a big way to put it. And they're represented by one capital letter and one lowercase letter. So we've been using T. It could be any letter, but we've been using T. In this case, we have an uppercase and a lowercase. So if this is for eye color, the capital letter could be the T for brown eyes, and lowercase, the T would be the blue eyes. That person would still have brown eyes because it has at least one capital letter, one dominant allele. All right, so 7th grade, we're going to spend a lot more time with the idea of alleles and how they're passed on in the future. But this is kind of the beginning lecture discussing some of the big terms. So we thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you along the way.
Thanks.